Hey everyone, it's Megan with Fiveable. Tonight we are covering in AP Psychology the start of the learning unit, which is going to include some classical conditioning and some observational learning. Just a few reminders as always, you can interact with me in two ways. There's the chat there on the right. You can see some people already talking. You guys can also talk amongst yourselves in the chat as well, as long as you're being nice and kind and everything like that. Or you can press that little ask a question button there towards the bottom of your screen, and then it just sends me a little flag letting me know you have a question, and I can pop in and answer it sometime when I have like a short break between topics or things like that. So the learning unit is a particularly big unit in psychology, so we're breaking it up over 2 days. So like I said, today we're doing classical and observational learning, and next time we'll do operant conditioning and then some kind of comparison between the different types. The following Tuesday, December 11th, we're going to start doing some semester review, probably some FRQ practice, just some big ideas that we'll go over, and just some other practice questions. And then on Tuesday, December 18th, we're looking at doing a possible Kahoot. So that should be kind of fun. People can log in. I can kind of walk through the questions. We can do a big live Kahoot session, which should be fun and give you lots of practice for the semester exams. I'm not sure how many of you have cumulative semester exams, but I know I give a cumulative exam. So kind of going back and thinking about all the units you've covered so far should be pretty helpful, I would think. So, oopsies, my thing is not working. There we go. The unit focus here, basically it's kind of the basic processes linked to learning in the learning unit. We're not so much talking about like studying out of a textbook type learning. That is more related to the memory unit, which comes up later. This is more kind of behavioral links to stimuli in our environment and things like that. So basically, how can I use this information to either encourage a good behavior in someone or to discourage a negative one? And this works with humans, this works with animals. You'll see some basic training principles and things here. This unit covers about 7 to 9% of the AP test, meaning 7 to 9 multiple choice questions will be coming from this unit. And kind of the main ideas, as mentioned before, include classical conditioning, operant conditioning, and observational learning. So to start with, we have to just kind of talk about what learning is. And so in regards to AP Psychology, we're talking about learning referencing this change in behavior due to experience. And so the big thing you need to learn here is that nurture is the key to learning. Behaviorists are people who study learning, and they are all about nurture. So we really downplay nature in this unit when we're doing the studying. Typically, right, we kind of look at both of them as playing a role and being important. But people who study learning, behaviorists, the behavioral approach to psychology is all about nurture. It's all about experience, and really does not focus on the nature aspect, the genetics, the things like that. So that's kind of the first way that we have to frame our thinking for this unit to really understand what's going on. And so the type of learning that we're talking about here is what we call associative learning. And so there's 3 main categories, as mentioned: classical, operant, and cognitive learning. And in classical learning or classical conditioning, we expect and prepare for a significant event such as food or pain. And the big thing that I would underline, star, highlight, circle, anything in my notes, is that classical conditioning is a natural behavior. It is a reflexive response. If it's not reflexive, if it's not natural, then it is not considered classical conditioning. So that's the first thing. If there's any sort of question asking you to identify the type of learning or the type of conditioning happening, it has to be a reflexive natural behavior. And we're going to come back to that when we go more over classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is when you learn to repeat an act that brings a reward. So if I train my dog to sit and then he gets a treat, he's more likely in the future to then sit again, and then I give him a treat. If, on the other hand, my dog pees on the carpet and I spray him with a water bottle, in the future he hopefully wouldn't pee on the carpet because he's going to avoid that unwanted result. So those are voluntary behaviors. You choose to sit, you choose to pee on the carpet if you're the dog. So that's really how one big way we differentiate classical and operant conditioning is whether or not the behaviors are natural or voluntary. And then cognitive learning is kind of a separate branch. This is more kind of the school type of learning. Specifically, we can learn cognitively through language, either through experience or observation. And then within cognitive learning, there's this branch called observational learning, and that's what we'll talk about a little bit more later, but it's pretty self-explanatory. I learn by watching others. So that's just the general overview of these types of learning. But specifically then, the name associative learning is giving us a hint at what that means. Associative learning, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, or cognitive learning all have something in common. And it's that the thing being trained is learning to associate two events. In this first example, this is a famous study. I think they're called sea slugs or sea snails or something like that. They would spray the slug with a little squirt of water. You can see that in the picture. And then give it an electric shock. And so what is your natural response if you get a shock? It's like you kind of jump and pull away. You don't like it, right? So what they saw was that eventually this slug thing started to learn to anticipate that shock based on the spray of water. So after a few times of doing this, if I squirt the slug, it shrinks back in fear or flinches before it's even shocked. It's learned to associate those two events. So that's kind of a form of classical conditioning. It's a natural response, your reflexive flinching in that scenario. It's associative learning. You associate the splash with the shock. The second example then is how we train, a lot of animals. If the sea lion or seal, it says it on there. I guess I should have seen that. The sea lion learns to balance the ball on its nose, then it gets a fish. And that's, just how you train your pet to sit or roll over or anything like that. If it does the good behavior that you want, then you give it a treat. Balancing a ball on your nose is not a natural occurring reflexive behavior, though. So that would be more of operant conditioning. But either way, in both of these examples, the animal being trained is learning to associate one thing with the other, which is why we consider classical and operant conditioning to be associative learning. And so the big name that you need to know in this unit, or one of the big names that you need to know in this unit, is Pavlov. And you might even see classical conditioning called Pavlovian conditioning. And so I just want you to kind of have that in the back of your mind. Those are the exact same thing. It just is sometimes phrased differently. So he's a Russian physician who was actually not even a psychologist. He was studying digestive secretions. And so wasn't even really planning on studying what he ended up studying. And he ended up talking about how psychology should focus on how organisms respond to stimuli in the environment. So he was really about these observable things, which again gets into this idea of behaviorism and being all about the environment and about the nurture aspect of learning. And so he really is important because he's going to lay the groundwork for future behavioral psychologists like Watson, which is another big name that we'll go over. But Pavlov's most famous experiment, and maybe you've seen this already, comes with this tone and food thing that's on the screen, and we'll look at it in a little more detail on the following slides. But basically, the organism that's being conditioned is learning to associate two stimuli together, the tone and food. And it begins with a reflexive or natural response. And in the case of, I'm going to actually flip ahead here because this is useful. In the case of Pavlov's experiment, what he did is this little tubing is hooked into the dog's mouth here, and they were measuring the secretions that came out when the dog smelled food. They basically presented the dog with food and then measured those secretions. But what they ended up discovering is that the dog began to anticipate the food coming because of like the door opening, basically the sound of the food coming. And so even before the food was placed, the dog would start to salivate. That was the natural response of the dog. It learned to associate, the person opening the door and making the noise for the food to come with the food. And so what we see if we go back here is that there's something that we call a neutral stimulus, and it gets paired with what we call an unconditioned stimulus. So in the case of Pavlov's dog, let's say there's a bell that's being played, because that's what they ended up eventually doing. If I play a bell for a dog, that's going to have no response, right? Except maybe the dog might get annoyed by it. It has no meaning. It's a neutral stimulus. It causes no kind of natural reaction. But if day after day after day, I play the bell and then place the food down, the dog starts to associate the bell with the food. And so the food is what we would call an unconditioned stimulus because it elicits a reaction. The unconditioned stimulus gets paired with the neutral stimulus. You see that there. So the bell is the neutral stimulus. The unconditioned stimulus is the food. And then we get the natural reaction, which is the saliva or the salivation of the dog. Eventually, what happens is if we do this day after day after day, this neutral stimulus, which is the bell, becomes what we call the conditioned stimulus because it elicits the same response. So eventually, once I do bell, food, saliva, bell, food, saliva, all I have to do is ring the bell and I get saliva. I don't even have to put the food out. And that is classical conditioning. The animal or the person has learned to associate the neutral stimulus as the conditioned stimulus. And so I think one of the hardest parts of this unit is all of these different phrases: neutral stimulus, unconditioned, conditioned. All of these different words and phrases are a little bit confusing. So I typically, when I'm doing this, and like a lot of times the questions will give you a scenario, like if I put the dog in here and do this and do that, label all the parts. That's what I would do. I would start by listing them all out and labeling them, and it makes it a little bit easier to understand. So in the salivating dog experiment, this is our starting point, the first 3 bullet points here. And I'm sorry if this is like repetitive, but I really want to make sure we understand this because this can be confusing. So we start again with the neutral stimulus, the tone. It has the tone or the bell, whatever you want to call it. It normally does not get a response from the dog. And then we also have an unconditioned stimulus, which is the thing that's going to automatically elicit a response. It's a natural thing that you have a reaction to. And then the unconditioned response is that reaction to the unconditioned stimulus. So we do tone, bell, food. And then after, all the conditioning happens, we move down to those final 2 bullet points. The conditioned stimulus is the tone, because then the tone elicits what we call the conditioned response, which is the dog salivates to the tone. And so what you need to know, and maybe this is helpful, is that the neutral stimulus always becomes the conditioned stimulus. So if you have those down as not the same thing, then you're not right. You need to look back. The neutral stimulus is always the conditioned stimulus after time, after we have that training period or that exposure period. And then the unconditioned response always becomes the conditioned response. So if you're labeling these, that's kind of an easy way to check if you got them right. If you have the same thing for those, then you're probably on the right track. So neutral stimulus always turns into the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response always turns into the conditioned response. So another example of this was from our textbook. The only thing I want to warn you about here is this is mislabeled. This should be neutral this should be, now what am I saying here? This should be the unconditioned stimulus. Is that labeled correctly? I was looking at it before and thought it wasn't. All right, so we have the unconditioned stimulus here, which is a kiss. And so if you kiss someone, you probably have some sort of an arousal reaction. We'll say your heart starts racing, right? So this is another example of classical conditioning. This onion breath, we're going to call it, it should be labeled the neutral stimulus right here. My apologies. So if you smell onion breath, it's probably not going to elicit this romantic response over here, right? The onion breath at first isn't going to make your heart race. But if your boyfriend or girlfriend or your significant other always has onion breath, pretty soon the mere smell at the bottom there, the mere smell of onion breath might elicit that heart racing of romantic arousal that you feel. Initially, the smell does nothing for you, but as you learn to associate that smell of onion breath with the kissing of your significant other, pretty soon, as we see on the bottom, just the smell of onion breath might give your heart palpitations and make you excited. It's just another example of classical conditioning. So let's take a look at a short video clip from the TV show Frasier. And so what we're going to do is I want you to just think about it for a minute and see if you can label all of the different parts of the conditioning that are happening. So what's the neutral stimulus? What's the thing that has no meaning at first? What is the unconditioned stimulus? That's the thing that's going to cause a reaction, and so on and so forth. So I always have a hard time getting videos to play. Let me know if for some reason it's not playing for you and you can't hear it.
From an early age,
oh, of course, there's a commercial.
He didn't understand.
Oh, it's not playing, is it, on your screen?
May I join you?
Give me 1 second here to see if I can get it up on the screen. All right, I guess we're going to skip that because I cannot. Oh, nope, that's not going to work either. No matter what I'm clicking on, it is not bringing the video onto your screen. I have another practice one, though, here, so we'll try that one instead. Sorry about that. So here is the scenario. Roxanne loves the singer Cardi B, but one time when she listened to the song Wake Me Up, it was so loud that she popped an eardrum. Thankfully, she made a complete recovery, but now when she hears any music by Cardi B, her ears start to hurt. So take a second and see if you can label those parts out. What is the neutral stimulus? What is the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, and then the conditioned stimulus and the conditioned response? If you want to put your thoughts in the chat, that's great. I know sometimes people don't feel comfortable doing that, so I'll just give you a minute or two to think. If people want to guess, that's cool. Otherwise, I'll go over it in a second. Oh boy, what happened there? Ooh. Okay, now I'm just clicking around trying to find the screen, and now it's putting me large, and I don't like that. Okay, well, am I here now? Can you guys hear me? Someone said that it paused. Okay, I don't know what's going on. I've hit some buttons. We're going to have to go like this now. I'm going to be a little bit larger on the screen. All right, so we've got Roxanne, and she likes the singer Cardi B. And so the neutral stimulus in this situation is the thing that has initially no response. So it would be the song, Wake Me Up. When she hears that song, she doesn't get any sort of reflexive response. That's the neutral stimulus. The unconditioned, the neutral stimulus is Cardi B music in general, not the song Wake Me Up, sorry. The unconditioned stimulus then in this scenario is the specific song Wake Me Up. And so the reason that it's the unconditioned stimulus is because it causes the response. And the response is, poo, her eardrums popped, right? So now that neutral stimulus, Cardi B, has become the conditioned stimulus, which causes her pain or like ear pain or whatever you want to call it every time she hears it. So Cardi B initially is like a neutral stimulus. It doesn't cause her any sort of reaction or pain or anything like that. But then she hears this one song and it's so loud it pops her eardrums, which is that unconditioned response. It's a natural behavior, a natural thing that happens. And so now Cardi B becomes this conditioned stimulus that causes her pain and agony or whatever you want to call it. Hopefully that's making sense for you guys. The biggest thing, and I can post some of these on the Facebook page, but just doing these over and over and over and practicing them and labeling them is going to be the key here for you guys coming up with just being able to do it on your own. Because there's a lot. I think the most confusing part is just all the like unconditioned, conditioned, all those words. So we'll keep kind of reviewing. The next part then, and these are just some basic vocab words from the unit, nothing that's super, I would say super confusing or anything like that. But basically, acquisition is how we do the learning, and you need to kind of know that. And this chart over basically shows, and maybe it's self-explanatory to you, but as the time passes, which is the bottom there, as time passes, the response gets stronger. So the more times that I ring the bell and put the food out, the stronger the response of the saliva for the dog will get. So over time, the dog has learned to combine those two things. So in the learning process, acquisition happens when the neutral stimulus is being conditioned. That's for classical conditioning. So as I'm conditioning the neutral stimulus, the bell, to being associated with the food, that is when the acquisition is taking place. Other stuff, I think we're going to skip that for today because it's kind of self-explanatory. Basically, these next two slides are just, I'll go over them. Spontaneous recovery is basically that even after a while, if I stop reinforcing this behavior, it can come back, is the idea there. Extinction is, I think, fairly self-explanatory, but let's say that I've conditioned the dog to respond to the bell, but eventually I stop playing the bell or I stop giving food with the bell. Well, then that response is going to go extinct. It's not going to exist anymore because just like I conditioned the dog to learn that bell food came together, if I stop giving the food when I do the bell, it will eventually go away as well. So that's the extinction process of the classical conditioning. And generalization could also occur. So maybe I play like a really high-pitched bell and the dog responds to it for food, but maybe the dog starts to like play any sort of pitch means food. And so it could be that the dog generalizes like a beep as meaning food. And so it kind of goes broader with its understanding of the conditioning. So, high pitch or low pitch, it maybe responds to both of those things. And so that little cartoon there is like an example of like a picture of generalization, right? Those snails kind of look like that tape dispenser, and you could maybe generalize between the two. It's when two similar things elicit the same response. The other cool thing that we can do with certain animals and obviously with humans who are highly intelligent, but we can actually teach them to discriminate between the stimuli. And so this is the opposite of generalization. I could teach a dog to only respond to a very specific tone. So it could be like high versus low. And they would actually eventually learn that only one of those tones mean food. So again, let's say high tone. Every time I play this high tone, I put the food out. High tone, food, high tone, food. And then I play a really deep low tone, but don't present food. the dog would learn then to only get excited or only respond to the specific tone. So they can actually discriminate between different types of stimuli, which is pretty interesting. And what's even more interesting, we can even go further complex in this. This is called higher order conditioning. And that is when we add in another stimulus. So let's say, we'll just keep using the dog example because it's the easiest. So we've got the tone, and we've got the food, and then we have the salivation. But let's add in another stimulus before the tone. I'm going to turn the lights on and off. So we do lights, tone, food, saliva. Lights, tone, food, saliva. Eventually, if I just flick the light switch on and off, I'm still going to get the salivation, which is the conditioned response. So basically, we can put multiple steps in here, and we'll still get the conditioned response. The thing, though, about higher order conditioning is that the response is usually a little bit weaker. The more steps we put into it, the less strong the response we get from the animal or the person is. This is also sometimes referred to as second order conditioning. So again, kind of knowing both those terms is important. All right, so why do we care about Pavlov? He's some dude from the 1800s. Well, there's two main reasons why we still study Pavlov. First, we've learned that conditioning applies to other animals, including humans, which we'll see coming up in some of the future slides. And what was really important about Pavlov was that, previously, a lot of psychological research wasn't like scientific. It wasn't done in a lab, and it wasn't done in ways that could be replicated. And so he really starts to make psychology a more firm science where we're studying it in a lab. And so those are two of the main reasons why Pavlov's legacy matters today to us in psychology. And another thing is that we've seen his applications then in future studies. So I mentioned before this guy named Watson. So his name is John Watson, and his famous experiment that he's known for is called the Baby Albert experiment. And basically what Baby Albert shows us is that we can classically condition emotion in people. So far it was kind of like, like basic food type responses, right? A dog's going to salivate when you put food in front of it, or someone's going to be afraid if you play like a really loud, scary tone. So we started to see if we could actually elicit like deep emotional responses in humans. And so it's kind of messed up. Baby Albert, I'm pretty sure it was an orphan that they like literally, no, he wasn't. He might have been this woman's baby. I'm not really sure where Baby Albert comes from, but it's pretty unethical. Like today we wouldn't experiment on a baby, right? Like that would not be a cool thing to do. It would be violating a lot of ethics. But what they ended up doing is conditioning an emotional response in the child. And so they've got this baby, and the baby's sitting there, and they would place a white rat on the baby. And the baby didn't mind. He thought it was like a cute little furry thing. And so he would be playing with the rat. And as soon as he touched for and reached the rat, like grabbed onto it, they would play, it was like a hammer against metal, like a really loud clanking noise to startle the baby. And then the baby would cry. So there's this neutral stimulus, which is the rat. The rat's not getting any reaction out of the baby. But then there's this unconditioned stimulus, which is this loud hammer clang, right? Which elicits a fearful, sad, scary response out of the baby. Eventually, then what's going to happen? They do this every time. They give the baby the rat. As soon as the baby touches the rat, loud noise. Rat, loud noise, crying. Rat, loud noise, crying. Well, eventually, just the sight of the rat made the baby freak out. He would cry, try and crawl away, scream, bury his hands in it, like really, really sad. The baby hated the rat because he had learned to associate the rat with the scary, loud noise. And so the neutral stimulus of the rat then becomes the conditioned stimulus, which leads then to the conditioned response of being fearful or scared. And so what they did then was they also proved that generalization could occur with this. Instead of a rat, they tried to bring in a white fluffy rabbit. Same response. Kid was terrified of the rabbit. even a white stuffed animal. The baby was terrified, didn't want anything to do with it. And so they proved that they could generalize this one fear of this small white fluffy rat to other similar stimuli, and the baby still elicited that same conditioned response. Extinction did eventually occur in the baby, like after they stopped doing it for a while, the baby stopped showing such fear towards it. And I'm not really positive with the outcome like later in life if they like restudied him or not. But basically pretty unethical, right? Like today we wouldn't want to like emotionally scar a child like that, like they did. But this is an application of how we've seen classical conditioning played out. And this was in, decade, I'm gonna go like 40s or 50s for when the decade was that these experiments happened. So then the second component that we're going to talk about briefly tonight is observational learning. So if you have any questions about classical conditioning, anything you don't think made sense yet, or still some questions, throw them in the Ask a Question section and I will come back to them. Otherwise, we're kind of moving on to the second half of tonight's session, which is observational learning. So observational learning, like I said, it's kind of self-explanatory. You learn by watching others. It's also sometimes called social learning. A lot of what we learn about like gender roles and things like that are all done through observing others. Like you watch what your mom does and so you mimic that, or you watch what your dad does and so you mimic that. Those are examples of observational learning. And those are like, observational learning is not explicit. Like I'm not watching it specifically saying, oh, I have to do this. It's just those cues that you pick up on over time. Is more so what that is referring to. And one way that we use the observational learning process is through modeling. And it's basically, the definition is there, the process of observing and imitating a specific behavior. And you do see little kids sometimes actually like explicitly do this. You know, if dad is doing something a certain way, then the little boy will come up behind him and try and do it too. And that's how little kids learn specific things, is that they see the people that they look up to doing them, like mom and dad or people on TV. And so then they also try those things out. And so the most famous study that comes out of observational learning is called Bandura and the Bobo doll. So you need to know the name Bandura. That's probably the only name you need to know in regards to observational learning. And then Bobo doll, super famous study. And so this study has a few steps, so kind of stick with me as we walk through it. But basically what they did is that children were placed into two groups, a control group, which we know is good experimentation. You always have to have a control group. And then group one was exposed to aggressive models of interaction with the Bobo doll. And a Bobo doll is just like a blow up, like kind of like, I don't know how to explain it, like a clown that kind of goes like this, you know, and you like punch it and it goes back and forth like this. I think you've seen those. And so in group one, they saw aggressive models of interaction with the Bobo doll. People punching it, hitting it, kicking it, calling it names, saying mean things to it. And they saw people of the same sex as them doing that and the opposite sex. Group two was exposed to non-aggressive models of interaction. So just like talking nice to the Bobo doll, maybe hugging it, things like that. And so what we saw is basically throughout this process, first, all the children were allowed to play fun games. Like there was just a room full of cool toys and things like that. Kids could play with it. The adult came in the room. So this is who like is modeling the behavior, right? The adult comes in the room and plays with them too. And so then eventually, depending which group the kids were in, the adult either continued playing nicely or attacked the Bobo doll. So in the group one where they were aggressive, they attacked the Bobo doll. Then the children are removed from the situation and placed into a second room. Now they're allowed to play some more. They get super cool toys. They get to play and have fun, but then they're told toys away. And so this makes angry children. And so then in the third situation, now they're placed with the Bobo doll. So they've already played in a room with the Bobo doll, seen an adult either act with it aggressively or nicely, and then now the children have been put in a situation that are going to make them angry. So we want to see how these angry kids react. So the children that had been exposed to the violent behavior imitated that same behavior with the Bobo doll. If the person that they had watched had punched the Bobo doll, they punched it. If the person had kicked it, they kicked it. The children that were in the nonviolent group were much less violent towards the Bobo doll, even though they were angry too. They had their toys taken away. We also observed that boys were more aggressive than girls, and we talked a little bit about that in the development unit as well, that physical aggression tends to peak more with boys than with girls. And what was interesting, and this learning, is that the same sex groupings observed more aggression than different sex. So if a boy saw a man beating up the Bobo doll, then there were similar levels of aggression than if a boy saw a woman beating up the Bobo doll. So basically, what this means is that kids are going to observe or learn behaviors from what they see adults doing, right? So if you're fighting with your husband in front of your kids and name calling, your kids are picking that thing up. But even more importantly, they tend to pick up more from the same gender as themselves. So little girls are going to pick up more from their moms, and little boys are going to pick up more from their dads. And so the implications of the Bobo doll tell us a few things. Violent behavior does get mimicked. Think about like violent TV and things like that. Think about like home life and how we're raising kids. You may think that little kids don't always pick up what's going on, but they definitely do. And really, most importantly, is kind of that like monkey see, monkey do saying, right? Whatever they see, they're going to do. So if you want to get your child to do something or to learn a behavior, the best way to do that is to do it yourself. So if you want your kid to fold their laundry, how are you going to get them to do that? Let them see you folding your laundry. If you want them to pick up their rooms, they should see you picking up your room, because that's the most powerful indicator of behavior. Even if you tell them, oh, good kids pick up their rooms, it's much more powerful if you're actually doing the thing that you want them to do. And so we did an updated version, not we like me, but like psychologists, did an updated version of the Bobo doll study with Barney and with the Power Rangers, because they wanted to find out if it just involved in-person interaction or if watching a TV show had the same effect on kids. And basically, the results of the study showed that the TV shows also impacted the kids' behavior. So in TV shows, we found that kids who watched Barney and then were then told to like free play, often free played in more like communal ways, like holding hands and being good, you know, getting along, right? Having fun. Kids who watched Power Rangers and then were told to play did a lot of kicking and punching and fighting behaviors because they were mimicking what they saw on Power Rangers. So what we let little kids watch, things like that, does matter because they will mimic the language, the actions, the things that they see on TV shows. And they also found, and this is interesting, that the most influential was a live adult. So if the person that they were watching on a TV show was like a real life person, if the person they were observing was like in real life, like punching the Bobo doll in real life, that had the biggest impact on them. The next biggest impact was watching like a real person on TV. And then the next was like a cartoon character. So the more like you the person is that you're watching, the more you're going to pick up on, observe, and mimic those behaviors. But all three, whether it was a live adult, a filmed adult, or a cartoon character, did produce more aggressive behavior than in the control groups. So they all mattered, basically. What allows observational learning to happen, and this is kind of the last thing we're going to talk about tonight, but it's called mirror neurons. This is one of the aspects of observational learning. But through various brain scans and studies, what we know is that when you watch someone else doing something, neurons in your brain that would be responsible for that same task also light up. So if I'm watching you tie your shoe, the parts in my brain that would be responsible for helping me tie a shoe are also kind of lighting up and practicing that. And so this is really how little kids start to learn and pick up on things, is because the mirror neurons, because it's like you're a mirror, right? You're reflecting back what you see. The mirror neurons there are like allowing little kids to practice things. And if they're seeing violence and aggression and things like that, their mirror neurons are practicing violence and aggression and bad things. If they're seeing people being helpful and empathetic and kind to one another, then their mirror neurons are practicing those same things as well. And so really, this is good for how we experience empathy, why we feel empathy towards one another, because the same parts in my brain that are feeling sad for you because you're going through a hard time are making me feel those same emotions because I have those mirror neurons. And so it explains like why as humans we kind of have connections to one another and we feel sadness and heartbreak for someone even though we might not be going through the exact same thing as them. It's those mirror neurons that enable that to happen. I think that was, one more thing. And so basically we can help our kids learn in one of two ways. We can model pro-social behavior, which is like being consistent, showing constructive, helpful things. It's that monkey see, monkey do ideology. And basically, if we effectively model the behaviors that we want children to do, they're going to learn to do them much more quickly. Or we could model antisocial behavior, and we know that that happens in homes all over the place too. Children who come from abusive homes often emulate that behavior. There's also this idea called the violence viewing effect, which basically means that kids are going to imitate the violence they see. We talked about that. But they also become more desensitized to it, meaning like seeing someone get their head shot with a shotgun, eventually you won't even have that much of a response to it. The first time you see it, you might be like, oh my gosh, that's terrifying. But if you see it time and time again, you become less sensitive to that, and it doesn't even have an impact on you. You're like, big deal. And so if kids learn to deal with their problems with violence, because that's what they see on TV, that's what they'll do in real life. And so it's really important to foster like pro-social, having positive role models, positive behaviors being emulated for children. So that was all I had tonight for classical conditioning and observational learning. Like I said, I might throw in the Facebook group some practice questions. So if you're not in the Fiveable Facebook group, make sure to join. I try and go on every day or two and add people who have signed up. But there's lots of, there's resources on there. You can ask questions, things like that. And I wanted to put in a plug because I know these sessions have been free and then we've been saying, that they're going to become private. As of December 1st, you're going to need a subscription to be joining here. So make sure that you go to the Fiveable website and get signed up, because otherwise you won't be able to watch the replays. You won't get to participate in the Kahoot review. And I know once we get closer to May, you're going to want to go back and watch a lot of these sessions to review. So make sure you get signed up. And if you have questions, you can always reach out to me on the Facebook group, and I'll get back to you about how to do that. But otherwise, next time we're going to cover operant conditioning and then kind of compare and contrast the two different styles, and then do a little bit of review from this unit. So I hope you guys had a good time tonight, and I will see you next week. Have a good one. Bye.